to the Sustainable Healthcare and Climate Health Aotearoa webinar series. Ko Matthew Jenks tōku ingoa. I'm an anaesthetist here in Dunedin and a board member of Otago, the New Zealand Climate and Health Council. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Niki Harre from the Department of Psychology at the University of Auckland. Niki is a well-known academic, teacher, and author of the books Psychology for a Better World and The Infinite Game, How to Live Well Together. If you have any questions that you think of during the webinar, if you please post them in the Q&A, use the Q&A button on the interface to post those questions, and I will do my best to have a look at those and put them to Professor Harre at the end of her presentation. So without further ado, Professor Harre, speaking about climate change and the infinite game, answers to 4 essential questions.
Kia ora koutou, it's wonderful to be here with you today. So, climate change and the infinite game, answers. Well, actually, I just put 4 essential questions rather than answers to them, but I am going to try and answer the questions that I pose. So, what are the 4 essential questions? What is the problem? Why do I feel anxious? How do I speak to a 12-year-old? And on whose authority should I act? So, let's get to the first one. What is the problem? So to answer this question, I'd like to introduce the metaphor first put forward by the philosopher James Harre, who suggested that in life there are at least 2 kinds of games. The infinite game, in which the purpose is to keep the game in play, and finite games in which the purpose is to win. Now, when I first heard James Harre talking about these games on a podcast, I thought that's what I'm doing when I'm doing sustainability. I'm trying to keep the game in play. And I've spent the next several years reading his books and running workshops and eventually writing my own book to try and explore this metaphor further. So the version you'll get today is my version with due respect to James Harre's inspiration. So the infinite game, as I'm going to use it today, is about keeping what we most deeply value in play and inviting others into the game. Finite games, on the other hand, are the rules, roles, bureaucracies, structures, and sometimes competitions by which we organise ourselves. So let's think of beach cricket as an example of the infinite game. You want players, so everybody on the beach is invited to play. It doesn't matter if they know what cricket is, doesn't matter if they speak the same language as you. Come on, we'll teach you. You set up a couple of teams, you explain the rules, you start playing, but the rules keep changing as you move through the game. If you have a 4-year-old who suddenly comes up with a bat, you don't try and bowl really hard and get the poor kid out. You change the rules to enable him to be part of the game too. The art of beach cricket, as in the art of any infinite game, is constant observation and awareness of what it takes for everybody to have fun, to be engaged, to use our bodies and to appreciate the beauty of the surroundings that we're in. We might even need to move the wickets a bit further up the beach if the tide comes in. Now, as I said at the beginning, remember, the infinite game is about keeping what we most deeply value in play. So what is it we value most deeply? So this is a question I've been asking literally thousands of people over the last few years. 1,085 of them were part of a formal research project where they were asked to give 3 things that they thought were of infinite value. Things that were precious, special, sacred, things that are of value for their own sake, that make the world truly alive. And a colleague and I, Helen Madden, produced a word cloud as a result of that. And I'm going to show you the results now. The bigger the word on the cloud, the more people said something of infinite value represented by this word. So looking there, I almost think that love is like an explosion, big bang, from which all of these other values develop. Family, helping others, empathy, purpose, freedom, children, friendship, laughter, civil society, the beauty of nature, humour, respect, kindness, trees, and so on. And to just simplify that, there seem to be 4 key quadrants into which these values fall. Human relationships, compassion, community, family, belonging, civil society. Human expression, so things like creativity, innovation, artistic expression, learning, growth, integrity, and so on. The natural world, trees, mountains, the ocean, very New Zealand word, and the whole, complexity, spirituality, God, faith, just realizing that you are part of an amazing universe by some miracle. So finite games now. Let's imagine a game of test cricket. So the first thing is you have to be selected to play. And I can hazard a guess none of you have been selected to play for the International New Zealand cricket team. Finite games also have rules that must be adhered to for the duration of the game. We couldn't just change the rules to suit a weaker player when we're playing an international game of test cricket. We want to determine who the winner is. Now, one of the things about finite games, remember they're the roles, rules, structures, bureaucracies, and sometimes competitions by which we organise ourselves, is that they tend to be looking to the past. How do you become a great cricketer? Or how do you enter a finite game like getting a medical degree? Well, you study from people who know how the game's played and you learn from them and you become often a clone of that game. So the cricket player can adjust to every move of the ball and the bat and so on because they know exactly how to respond. They've almost become an automaton for that game. As I said, the rules don't change for the duration of the game, and at the end of the game, the winners quite often get to choose what game is played next. They're really good at the game they've just played, so they say, let's play it again. Well, cricket, what does it matter if we just keep playing cricket the same old way over and over again? But if we think of other finite games like the oil game, like the using huge amounts of energy game, like the consumption of material goods game, we can see how they become problematic if the winners of those games get to decide what happens next and they say, let's play the way we always have done. Now, I just want to stress that finite games aren't necessarily a problem in and of themselves. In fact, the infinite game, keeping what we value most deeply in play and inviting others into the game, requires these rules, roles, structures, bureaucracies. I'm glad my doctor's been to medical school. I'm glad we're required to wear masks on buses. I'm glad people have to have a driver's license in order to be out on the road. There are reasons for these rules and they're important, but we always need to be sensitive to the surroundings. So the answer to question number one, what is the problem? That we've come to mistake so many finite games for the point, leading to a difficulty in keeping infinite values at the core of our institutions. So often, instead of talking about, does this make human relationships and expression in the natural world and this whole complexity flourish, we say, how do we make this work? And we think only of the way we've done so in the past. Okay, second question, why am I anxious? So, first of all, let's think a little bit about what emotions are. So emotions are often called feelings, and they're not called feelings for nothing. They're called feelings because emotions exist in the body. They're a reaction, a physiological reaction we have, combined with a whole series of mental images and combined with a tendency to act in a particular way. So in this beautiful picture, you can see these people's bodies full of a sort of feeling of exhilaration, full of connection, full of wanting to connect and have fun together. Now, the psychologist Barbara Fredrickson's written a lot about emotions and the action tendencies that come from them. And she's roughly divided emotions into positive and negative. Because we're talking about anxiety, we're talking about negative emotions. And what she suggests is that negative emotions create a desire to focus on the issue at hand, a desire to solve the problem, and attempts to tackle the problem quickly and directly. However, if that can't be done because of the nature of the problem, these may also lead to denial because the emotion itself is so uncomfortable, we want to distract ourselves from it and get rid of it. So we'll come back to these action tendencies in a minute. First of all, I want to talk about two major negative emotions, fear and anger. So if we think about human beings as having a flight or fight reaction to danger, fear is the flight reaction to danger. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, you might recognize this scene. This is when Sam is being confronted by some White Walkers. You can tell by his face that he is full of fear. And what is he doing? He's fleeing and hiding and running behind a rock. Now, this actually solves the problem because Sam lives to the very end of the last season of Game of Thrones. And quite often fear is a useful emotion if we can directly handle the problem. Dodgy spot on your arm, feel fear. What is that? Go to the doctor. The doctor gives a diagnosis, treatment, or tells you you're fine, whatever it is. Problem goes away. Fear has been useful. But when we're thinking about climate change and when we're thinking about fear generated in that context, we can't just solve the problem and make it go away. The temptation is to try and deny that the problem exists and to go into the state of trying desperately to ignore it because that's all we can do. Now, anger is the other emotion I want to talk a little bit about. It's the fight side of a threat. It's attacking. It's that thing you feel when you're infuriated with somebody or maybe everybody in the world. And here Daenerys Targaryen is feeling angry. She's got her dragons and she's about to set light to King's Landing, which is behind her. She can solve that problem directly and absolutely by doing so. Creates a whole lot of other ones, but there you go. And social movements are actually full of anger. Here's our poster child for climate change, Greta Thunberg. Really easy to find lots of pictures of Greta Thunberg looking really angry. So anger can result in this impulse that is highly motivating, but it's basically destructive. Now, anxiety is a kind of chronic combination of fear and anger. We often talk about it as a type of fear, but I think it also involves a type of anger, because anxiety is different from fatalism. Fatalism is a sense that, yeah, things might be going wrong, but there's nothing I can do about it. But anxiety is a sense that things are going wrong and somehow I should be able to solve this problem. Now, eco-anxiety has been defined by the American Psychological Society as an association as a chronic fear of environmental doom. And recently I've heard people talking about it as a kind of pre-traumatic stress. So it hasn't happened yet in most contexts, for most people in Aotearoa at least, but the fear that it will happen is kind of traumatizing in and of itself. And why do we have this eco-anxiety? Well, one reason is because we are surrounded by messages telling us that everything is going to custard. Articles like this, you may not have seen this particular article. I used it in an exam with my students recently, which is why I've got it on hand, but you are very familiar with the drill. We've got 12 years to limit climate change catastrophe, warns the UN. Now, this article has two main threats to it. One is the physical planet is going to wreck and ruin. There's only a dozen years left. We'll have worse risks of droughts, floods, extreme heat, and poverty. We need unprecedented and urgent changes. The coral reefs otherwise will be completely eradicated, and so on. Now, the second key thread is that the politicians are useless. So you can see here in brown, policymakers commissioned the report at the Paris climate talks in 2016, but the gap between science and politics has widened. Donald Trump, our favourite evil villain, has promised to withdraw the US, and what's more, the Brazilian president looks like they're going to open the Amazon rainforest to agribusiness. Favourite villain, sort of poster child of destruction, the Amazon rainforest, all going to wreck and ruin. So this is what I call an apocalyptic double play. Planet is being destroyed, politicians are useless, and we are told we must face the truth. To do anything less is to be in denial, is to be shunting away that fear, which you should not do because you should man up and take it like it is. So what this leads to is this awful kind of combination of anxiety and control. We're anxious because something bad might happen, and we suspect we should be able to stop it from happening. So why am I anxious? Because we are surrounded by apocalyptic narratives in a culture that promotes individual responsibility, giving us both the sense we should act decisively, but also the inability to do so. Now, just before stopping here, I want to point out that anxiety isn't all bad. It's actually vigilant, can prompt us to take opportunities to mitigate problems, and strong emotions about climate change are related to support for climate change policy. So in a sense, having a population that's anxious is good for climate change action. It's not very good for us as soldiers in that war. But what would make it even better, what would bring together that sort of atmosphere of possibility for change with people being hopeful and sort of happy, is these convincing solutions, which entails hope. So hope's going to be the part of the next one. How do I speak to a 12-year-old? I think I originally had a 10-year-old, but then I pitched it slightly higher. But, you get the age range idea. So first of all, a little bit about hope. Hope is intrinsically and absolutely a collective. There is no hope for this planet without a strong collective. If you think about the planet going to rack and ruin, one side of that apocalyptic narrative, there's a sense in which that isn't quite so bad if only we could trust people to respond to that properly. You know, if Lower Hutt or other low-lying areas in New Zealand are vulnerable, it's not so bad if we have a policy that means that people get rehoused and don't lose everything as a result of that. So hope is absolutely crucial and absolutely a collective emotion in which we can only feel it if we trust that we're with other people who are in the same game as we are. So how do you talk to a 12-year-old? Let's imagine this 12-year-old says, because of climate change, I might not get to be an adult. If I'm alive in 10 years, I won't have a job or anywhere to live, and I can never have children. That's actually, quite frankly, a kind of reasonable thing for a 12-year-old to say if they've been caught in this double apocalyptic narrative. So what do you say as a wiser older person? Well, you might say, yes, you're right. We're in a terrible situation. Nobody's doing anything about it. You should try and save the world. You only have 12 years. How long you've been alive? Do it now or all will be lost. Well, that to a 12-year-old child, or frankly to an adult, creates anxiety, that double mind that I've talked about before. Let's imagine a different response. There are lots of adults concerned about climate change. They have it all under control. No need for you to worry, because soon we'll have the technology to solve these problems. That's what the people who push the apocalypse are afraid of. Denialism, or what has been called by psychologists complacent hope. Hope that means that you don't need to do anything. And so, you know, if everybody does that, then nothing changes. Okay, here she goes again. And here's the third kind of response. There are lots of people concerned about climate change. They're working very hard to find solutions. All over the world, scientists, engineers, teachers, community leaders are getting together. People have solved really hard problems before. When you are older, you can join them. And that's motivational hope. That is saying that you can be part of this process. It's not actually promising a resolution. If you look at the language, it's quite careful. It's not saying there's not a problem and it's not saying we'll solve it, but it is saying that it is possible to solve it and is saying you can be part of that. Okay, final point on whose authority should I act. Now I want to just spend a couple of minutes going over this slide. I saw this presented by an Australian climate scientist and talked to her after her talk. Where did you get that slide? It's fabulous, and I've been using it ever since. So what this shows is an analysis of the introduction of certain socially progressive legislation in the US over a period of a long time, 250 years. And you can see this clearly because it'll be on your screen. So here we have, for example, interracial marriage. Now these are the 50 states in the US. The number of states increased over time, which is why this grey line gets higher and higher. In 1787, this number of states, I haven't got the exact numbers, maybe 8 or so, allowed interracial marriage. Long plateau, few more states had interracial marriage on board, long plateau. Then all of a sudden, a whole lot of states leapt on board until in 1967, it became federally mandated. So whenever you see a little circle like that, that means that the entire nation now has to have, laws have to allow interracial marriage. Let's look at a very recent one. This graph finishes in 2005. This is same-sex marriage, marriage equality. Now, what's really interesting about this one is here we have about 2005 or so, Massachusetts, I think, the first state to allow it. All of a sudden, it becomes legal in 36 states within a period of about 5 years. Then, just off this graph, it becomes federally mandated. So now all states have to allow same-sex marriage within their marriage laws. And so what I think this graph shows, for those of us who are old enough to remember sort of gay rights movements, it's not as if gay rights movement started here in 2005. For years and decades, people were coming out, they were giving talks, they were running for parliament, they were putting themselves out there and failing, if you like, never kind of worked quite as they hoped. And then boom, all of a sudden something happens in society to enable this particular piece of legislation and all these others. So I think it's really important to remember that change, the moment of change, is unpredictable. We're in complex systems, but the preparing for change, the moving together to do stuff, that is the game we're in, not in actually creating the change per se. So last slide, on whose authority should I act? Well, to make the next move, you do not need to be up to date with the latest climate change reports. The general gist is pretty damn clear. Just go what you know needs to be done. You do not need to swear allegiance to the prophets of doom, not going around telling people, I think the latest figure is we've got 18 months. You don't actually need to do that. It's not written up in the sky as a rule. You do not need to figure out the best action. Good enough is good enough. And you do not need to become someone alien to yourself. Do what feels right to you in your context. Don't follow that person that says this is the way it must be done. I think you do need friends, whānau, people around you, absolutely. You need something I want to call grace. You need a sense of kind of hope, possibility, that it's all worth it, that, yeah, that this planet needs our care. You need discernment. You need to make judgments between things, and you absolutely need persistence. And that is me. Thank you. So sorry I didn't answer my question. I do have a last slide. On whose authority should I act? No one's. You, as the good people who came before you and will come after you, will do the best you can to keep what we most deeply value and play. You'll respond to and issue invitations to join the game. We don't actually need you, but whatever you offer will be a gift to us all.
Thank you very much, Niki. That was fantastic, and there's so much food for thought in there. I think everybody was transfixed. So we've had a couple of questions come through, but I think everybody was just captivated. So I've got a couple that have popped up, and I think the first one's a good one actually. It says, when you are older you can join them, and that's in quotes, quoting your slide, as motivational hope for young children. But surely the climate strikers have no minimum age limit. And I took my 5-year-old daughter along to the strike for climate, and I'm not 100% sure how much she understood why we were going along. But is there a minimum age? Are you saying children should not be activists but beneath a certain age?
I guess what I'm saying is children should not have to be activists. And I think that, you could modify the message. I have to admit that this was based on when I actually, at about the age of 10 or 12, was terrified about the ozone layer. And I said to my father, they say that the ozone is being destroyed. And my father said to me, pretty much what I said there, don't worry, lots of people are working on it, blah, 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 blah. And in that moment, that's what I needed to hear. So I guess I would adopt I think it's incredibly important, this rhetoric that it's up to the young people are doing it. Honestly, that is such a problematic rhetoric. They're not in positions of power. They cannot and will not do it. I mean, they're motivating and they're lovely, and I'm totally in favour of taking them to marches and encouraging them. But we as adults need to fully and squarely take responsibility. I really, really think that. And we need to hold young people through this process. So they can be activists, but I really actually do think they're trainee activists rather than fully fledged, even if that's a controversial thing to say.
Thank you. I have a question. It's another emotion. It's not fear or anger. It's got its own word. It's called solastalgia, and some people describe it as a type of existential distress caused by environmental damage to one's home. And another way of describing it is a form of homesickness. And I think this must be particularly intense for those people who are facing the imminent threat of losing their homes. So Pacific Islanders in countries like Kiribati, or low-lying coastal regions in New Zealand, particularly Māori communities, have a long-standing attachment to their homes. This seems like a really reasonable response. The sadness at the loss of your home seems a little more difficult to tackle than, say, addressing anxiety and fear by framing it with hope. I think the solastalgia is a more difficult emotion. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're getting at here is these sort of actual, real, physical things that happen in the planet, and that that's a physical reality. I actually think that most people are displaced. We're displaced. It depends how many generations you look back and as to how displaced we are, but we move around this planet, or at least here in Aotearoa we do, with great frequency that I think is quite disorienting for all of us. So I actually think that sense of who you are and where you belong as somebody that's grown up in a place, if that gets ripped out from you, that's really hard to put yourself back together from, especially if you also lose community with it. Andreas Neefer here at the University of Auckland looks at people in the Pacific who have been relocated due to climate issue, climate related weather events, and sometimes they'll move a whole community to a different place. And, what do you do? How do you live? Where is your life when previously it's been tied in a really embodied daily way to a certain kind of context? I think that's absolutely right. And I don't think it's solvable in a sort of psychological sense because it's an embodied thing.
We have a message from a question from one of our sustainability managers. She believes that hope is a fantastic perspective to take on many of these issues. And how do you deploy this in a role as, say, an advocate in your organisation or a sustainability manager in your organisation when you're working with across a huge number of staff in a large organisation? Is there practical ways that this can be deployed?
Yeah, well, I think about a people-focused systems approach, basically, at an organisational level. I've done a lot of work in this at Western Springs College, Ngāpuna o Wairea here in Auckland, and also at the University of Auckland. And I think the approach you take at an organisational level is you gather together the people who care. You meet regularly, creating a sort of bridging structure across the organisation of people who want to work on these issues. And you all work on projects that are within your control. So this might be as simple as, getting reusable cups in your coffee room instead of disposable ones. It might be, getting their fleet to be more economical, electric, whatever. So everybody's got different pieces, and it's by the coming together and discussing these that you actually create the hope. So I've talked about hope again as if it's a sort of psychological thing that you can conjure up, but actually it needs constant refreshing and constant reassurance that you're really in this together. And we have a network here at the University of Auckland like that. I'm not so in favour of sort of big goals and big attempts to get everybody on board to get something sorted, as opposed to this idea of all working in our locations and the joining the dots in a sense in that way. Having said that, if our university would like to have a, firm policy and goals towards climate action, that would be nice.
Well, I think we're unfortunately going to have to wrap things up there because we've hit 4:30. There are a number of good questions coming through. Professor Harre has said that she will, if she is able, answer some of those questions via email. So we'll put that email address on the website, I think is how we'll do it. So I just want to say a big thank you to Professor Harre for a fantastic talk. And I think if you want more detail, I would encourage you to seek out her book, The Infinite Game. I've read it and it's a great book. Please join us again in 2 weeks' time on the 6th of October at 4 p.m. for a final session by Dr. Annette Bolton from ESR. She is speaking about strengthening adaptation planning and action to climate-related health impacts in the Pacific Islands, what we can learn from Tonga. In no hora.